How's it going? Welcome back to Shameless Popery. It's Joe Heschmeyer, and just doing bi-weekly Ask Me Anything live stream. So, for those of you who aren't familiar, here's how it works. If Vanessa just actually shared it in the chat, but it's really simple. If you have a question, you can send a super chat, and she will put it in a document, and I will answer your question. There are some questions from there's some questions from 2 weeks ago that I will get to first and then get into your questions as everybody shows up. So I didn't give any pre-warning for this one. So I know this will go at least an hour. It might go more than that. Sometimes I do a couple hours. So yeah, I do have one other thing I've got to record today. So I can't do ad infinitum. If I don't get to any of your questions today, I will move them to 2 weeks and we can do it then, or we can maybe do an encore episode of some yet to be announced time and place. We'll see. All right. Also, shout out to Gannon. He says, hi there. I've been watching your videos for a few weeks now, and me and my girlfriend are thinking of converting from Anglican and Baptist to Catholicism. God bless you. So please pray for Gannon and his girlfriend, just that God will guide them during this time. It's a big issue, and that's wonderful. One shepherd, one flock. This is the goal. So praise God. Michael Bucamp, last time, said, opinion on the Eastern Orthodox argument that the filioque is true, but illicitly added to the creed. My understanding is that it's a little more complicated than that. So if you go back and look at the canons of the First Council of Nicaea, the strangest part is you don't have the Nicene Creed there. So it's something that in the Nicene Creed in the form that we have it today comes from the First Council of Constantinople. And so what appears to have happened is that there was a baptismal creed that becomes kind of the basis for the Nicene Creed. And in 325, they adopt this as like a creed they believe in. And then in 381, the First Council of Constantinople gives an adaptation of this, but there's actually some question up until the Council of Chalcedon in 451 as to kind of what the status is of the creed. And so during this time period, there actually appear to have been several different forms of the creed where people didn't think they were bound to one and only one kind of variation of the creed. And then after that, it becomes much more standardized. So what you seem to have are regional variations of what we now know as the Nicene Creed. So it's different than everyone had this one, and then like the Pope or some bishop in Spain or something else decided to tinker with it. It's much more like there was a core nucleus that was then adapted in several different ways. And this makes sense as well of the obvious similarities between the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed. If there's kind of a core creedal formula, but you might have a slightly different creed that you use in your local or regional church if there are different heresies and controversies you're combating, that you want to make sure somebody isn't falling into the heresies you're worried about rather than falling into the heresies that are maybe an issue half a world away. So regional creeds seem to have been a thing, and that I think accounts for the difference between the filioque version and the non-filioque version. Second, Zen is peace. And so first of all, Zen is peace. I realized afterwards I'd missed your you had some urgency about trying to get answered, and I really apologize for that because I missed it at the time. But Zen is peace says, as a Muslim who's curious about Christianity, if Jesus died for our sins, then how can we still sin and need to go to confession, etc.? Thanks. It's a great question. And this is a question I think a lot of Christians struggle with as well. The way I would frame it is like this. You and I have sinned, and we have incurred debts because of our sins. If you want to talk about these as debts to God or just debts in the nature of justice, that we have violated the order and justice of the created world. And by ourselves, we're incapable of resolving the problems that we have created. So Jesus, by his life, death, and resurrection, has resolved those problems. He has offered something more pleasing to God than sin is displeasing. So the idea goes like this. If, let's say you've got a kid who breaks a store window. They're, playing ball, and the baseball hits the store window, shatters the window. And it's a couple $100 fix. Now, your child is incapable of paying for this. They're a little kid. You could offer a couple $100 to try to make this right, or you could actually go above and beyond that and give them something worth more. You could give them, $1,000. Now the shopkeeper is likely to say, "Yeah, I will." The matter is totally resolved. You've more than paid off the thing that was owed, and you've made an action that not only remedied the harm caused by your child's actions, the things they weren't able to solve, but you've also created a situation now where you're in the good graces of the shopkeeper. The shopkeeper, the next time you come in the store, is likely to say, "Hey, I'm going to give you the best price I've got. You know, come, got this stuff that just came in and it's not even on the shelf yet," because you've now kind of won over their good graces. That's an imperfect analogy, but if you think about it that way, this is the Catholic model and this is the historic Christian model of the cross, that all of the sins, your individual sins, my individual sins, all the sins of all the world, these are all things that we are incapable of resolving on our own. But Christ comes along and he resolves this in the sense of offering something worth more than sin to the Father, because sin displeases God the Father. But what Christ does on the cross is gives himself fully and completely to the will of God and gives himself to the point of being tortured and killed totally voluntarily out of love. And love and obedience and fidelity to the will of God, that is worth more than animal sacrifice. That is worth more than, all of the strict observance of all the rules. That's worth more than all of this. Like, what God wants is to have a faithful and loving people. And Jesus comes and does that perfectly as the infinite, uncreated Son of God. And so he puts, if you think about, instead of $1,000 for, this finite cost of like a $200 window, he gives an infinite amount. And this infinite amount more than satisfies everyone who could possibly ever err. So if you go and break another window tomorrow, it doesn't mean you didn't do something wrong, but it does mean that you can point back to that thing and plead forgiveness because you've already received an infinite gift, or an infinite compensation, if you want to put it that way. Like, what Christ has done is an infinite merit on the scale. So every sin you or I will ever commit, it's not that it doesn't matter, but it is that as long as it is covered by the blood, it's taken care of. So where do we go wrong? Well, there'd be two ways. One, people who say, "I reject him," in the case of, I gave an example of a father and son. So maybe an older brother, younger brother, just because Jesus isn't our father. So let's say your older brother is the one who does this, and you're a teenager now and you think you're too cool. So you decide, I'm either going to pay for this myself because I'm strong enough, I'm big enough, I don't need to worry about it. Or maybe it's like, I'm too ashamed to tell my older brother I screwed up again. Or maybe you just say, I hate my older brother, I want nothing to do with him, I reject everything he's done. Those would be equivalent to all of the ways we can reject the infinite gift of God. We can walk away by saying we reject Christ. We can be too ashamed to take our sins forward to have them dealt with, or we can be too proud and think we can handle the problem of sin on our own, and we just simply cannot. So that's how it's possible for us not only to sin, but to sin in such a way that we wouldn't be forgiven, not because there wasn't enough in the infinite offering of Christ, but because we refuse to allow that to be applied to our case. So there's much more that could be said, but I hope that this makes sense to you and explains why we would still need to go to confession and admit what we've done. And this is clearly, wrapped up in how the New Testament presents all of this, that Christ is breathing the Holy Spirit on the apostles so they can forgive sins. All right, that's that. I'm not just concluding the last question. That's the name of the next person. Says, how to understand civil versus church law in light of Jesus' statement to render unto Caesar what is Caesar and to God's what is God's. Yeah, so all authority, both civil, sometimes called secular authority, which just means the authority of the world, the secula, and church authority is coming from God. If you think about Jesus when he's on trial before Pontius Pilate, he reminds Pilate he'd have no power unless it was given to him from on high. So whenever we're thinking about either civil law or church law, start with this. You have a duty to obey valid laws because that law is ultimately derived in divine authority. Divine authority given to someone who was not you. So if you decide to just say, I don't want to do it that way, too bad. It's not up to you. You were not given that power. You were not given that authority, and you don't want to be a rebel. This, however, also creates a limiting principle. Because if you've got an authority from someone else, what's called a delegated authority, you can't use it outside of the way it's been delegated. For instance, my wife and I are in the early stages of trying to buy a home. So everyone go join Patreon. It's bananas out there. We're in the early stages of trying to buy a home. So we're going through all this process, and we got a realtor who's a friend of ours from church, actually, which is great. If he decided to go and misuse his authority on our behalf and just offer some price we couldn't possibly afford, say, that would have no validity and no standing because he didn't actually have the authorization to use his authority in that way. Now apply that to the case of civil and church or ecclesiastical or canon law, and it works like this. Martin Luther King talks about this, by the way, in his letter from a Birmingham jail. An unjust law is no law at all is a basic principle of natural law and a basic principle of Catholic morality. This is something St. Thomas Aquinas talks about that Martin Luther King quotes Aquinas directly. The idea being this, like, again, if you try to use a delegated authority in ways you weren't delegated, you know, when I was a lawyer, if somebody said, settle this case between, I don't know, $1 million and $5 million, and I said, we will offer you $10 million, I don't have the legal authority to do that. I have a general legal authority to act as a representative for this client. I was not delegated the particular authority to misuse my delegation in this way. And so it would just be of no legal effect. I mean, I would get in trouble for trying to offer something I had no right to offer. I could, you know, face sanctions or disbarment or whatever. I don't know. I've never tried to do anything like this. I have no idea. But it wouldn't just become valid because, oh, well, that's the lawyer. He can do whatever he wants. No, it doesn't work like that. There's a limit to this. Similarly, you know, in a criminal case, if you were representing, you know, a criminal defendant who was mentally sound, you couldn't just like change their plea for them and be like, actually, they'll accept your plea offer or they're going to plead guilty now. You can't do that. That's not within your authority as a delegate. So any kind of delegated authority works like that. So within the state, any just laws, any laws that are in keeping with the law of God, whether I like them or not, are binding on me and I have to obey them. But if a law contradicts the law of God, then I have to disobey it if obeying it would be sinful. It doesn't mean I have to confront every single unjust law. There's plenty of unjust laws that might be on the books that we don't have to grapple with, but that's the core kind of idea. So what happens if church law and civil law conflict? Well, presumably in that case, so we'd need a more concrete case. But if you have something like the laws trying to require priests to break the seal of confession, any priest who cooperated with that law would be sinning. They must disobey it, no matter what the legal consequences are. And this is why, you know, early Christians regularly faced martyrdom. It's worth pointing out. Saints Peter and Paul both have really strong things to say. You know, St. Peter says, honor the emperor. St. Paul has that whole section in Romans 13 about the need to obey the emperor. And both of them are killed by the emperor because even though they are very clear about these principles, they also are very clear about the limiting principle that they're not going to obey men when doing so would contradict obeying God. So this is why in Acts, St. Peter says we must obey God rather than men. That's not denying the legitimacy of delegated authority. It's recognizing the limits of it. So that's that. Hopefully that helped you. Scott said, if Jesus stood on a river, do you think he'd stand still or move downstream like on a conveyor belt? That's a really fascinating question. I would be inclined to think he would stand still. And I'm basing that partly just off of pictures, probably, partly off of the images of the parting of the Red Sea and parting of the Jordan. And then certainly the impression one gets of the walking on the water during the storm on the Sea of Galilee is not that he's like floating away from them, but that he's walking towards them. So, yeah. Sir Cadzalot says, plans to share why you discerned out of seminary. You're getting a lot for $2 Canadian on this one. Sure, I'm happy to. When I went into seminary, was torn between 4 different dioceses. I'd been dating a young woman. I'd actually been dating her for like 3 years, was planning on getting married, and was starting to get asked by people, why I wasn't discerning the priesthood. And the honest answer had been, and my whole time as being a really serious Catholic, I'd been in a relationship. But enough people started to ask that I realized I had to take it seriously. So long story short, I ended up having to break up with her and move forward with seminary. But I'd lived in 4 different dioceses and had connections in all 4 dioceses. I was working in one, living in another from the third, and had gone to college. And my parents were about to move to the fourth. So kind of a complicated situation of knowing, like, well, where do I end up here? And the best bit of advice that I had, again, this is coming into seminary, was to go where you have the most peace of soul. And I realized as soon as there was a priest from the Diocese of Arlington, Virginia, who told me that, but as soon as he said it over dinner, and immediately I knew that means Kansas City, Kansas. Like, I feel at home there in a way I didn't feel at home in the place I was living and calling my home. And it was I wouldn't have known that prior to that kind of experience in the moment. I've just been like, okay, I guess means I'm going to go back and live with my parents for a little bit and then enter seminary and all this. So I did, and thanks be to God, they were very good to me. The Archdiocese of Kansas City, Kansas, I had an amazing experience. Wonderful diocese. Archbishop Naumann, who's recently retired, fantastic, holy bishop who had a real love for his seminarians and would go on annual like pilgrimages or retreats with us to have some time away from all of our duties and responsibilities to pray and to be together and to be with him. And this is going to be important for the story because as I get closer to ordination, to the diaconate, I had been looking forward to this from the time I, knew I was going to seminary. But as I started to get closer, I realized I didn't have that peace of soul that is the infallible sign of God's approval or presence. There's a kind of peace that the world can't give you, that only Christ can give. And if you have it, you need to do whatever you have peace about doing. I mean, if you think you have that peace around something morally evil, that's clearly not it. But if you're discerning something that is morally permissible and you feel that peace in doing it and you don't feel that peace in not doing it, you have to listen to that. So there's a lot of other stuff going on there. And long story again, short, the end of the summer, I'm supposed to get ordained in October to the diaconate. And in August, we go to Colorado Springs and then have like our annual pilgrimage with the bishop. And then on the ride back from Colorado to Kansas City, it's maybe 7-8 hours, something like that. Don't quote me on that. The bishop has like on the bus, he rides the bus with us. She's amazing, right? And he just leaves a seat next to him open. Oh, sorry, hang on just a second. She's married just silence. He leaves the seat next to him on the bus open, and it's just a rotating seat. People can come up and talk to him for a little bit, and then just let him know one-on-one kind of how everything's going, and then go back to their seat. It gives you a little more of a private kind of time to converse with him without having to like set up an appointment. It's a little casual, but it's nice, especially because you've just had this, this pilgrimage, and it might have stirred something up, and something might be coming up. And a lot of guys, they go up there for a few minutes. They kind of check in. They just say, yeah, everything's going really well. I'm loving seminary. I'm looking forward to the next year. And then they're to the back. Somebody else comes up. He and I talked for like a suspiciously long period of time. I don't know, maybe half an hour. And I just really laid out where I was and the anxieties I was feeling and everything else. And he said, look, if you need to take a pastoral year, take a pastoral year. And I hadn't felt free to do that because people had bought plane tickets and non-refundable hotels and everything else to travel to Italy to come see me get ordained. And so I'd felt very unfree. And I hadn't really realized I hadn't felt free. I just didn't want to let everybody down, especially if I was just being like nervous, especially if I just had like cold feet. This was the closest I'd ever come to like a final vocational sort of decision. And so, you don't know how you're going to react to something like that till you react to it. So I'd heard all these stories about people who, would freak out and get anxiety. And then it was still their calling. And then they moved forward and everything was great. So I wondered if I was that. I was worried about wasting thousands of other people's dollars over that. But when he told me I could just take a break, it was amazingly relieving. And that was itself very telling to me. Like, I don't want to be relieved about not getting ordained, because this is what I thought I was meant to do. And this is what I wanted to do for such a long time. So that was kind of the beginning of the end. I went on a 10-day silent retreat, really discerned I was called to marriage. Um, then I'm very open and honest about all of this with the bishop, but said, I don't want to just jump out of formation. And so he said, you know what, let's put you at the University of Kansas. They have a Catholic center, and you can spend a semester there, do an update. If you need another semester, that's fine. If you feel ready going back into formation or something like that, that's fine too. It's great because it's on the same basic academic calendar that seminary's on. So it wouldn't have been a totally disruptive thing, no matter what. And the University of Kansas, the Catholic Center there was and is amazing. That's a story for another day. But you've got two great priests who are there. You've got Focus, which is there. You've got like the local campus ministers who were brought on by the campus center. You've got two professors who are teaching Catholic stuff like history and all that for credit. You've got what else? You got a lot. And and you have this group, School of Faith, which I ended up leaving seminary to go work for, because they come and teach, and they do a lot of that kind of thing. So I was having an amazing experience, and it only confirmed, even as I'm with these two very good priests helping with mass and everything else, like, I don't feel like I'm called to. I love what they're doing. I don't think I'm called to do what they're doing. So then I left, and I had a friend who I'd not talked to in a long time because I was trying to figure out my vocation, named Anna. I called her sister and said, "Is she single?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "Do you think she'd mind if I asked her out?" And she said, "I don't think so." And so I got on a plane and flew down to surprise her in Phoenix. And then the rest is history. She is now my wife and the mother of my children. So there you go. Somewhere there's an article actually where Simca Fisher interviews me and like three other people. And so I'm in there. So yeah, there you go. Hope you got your $2 Canadian worth. I'm totally teasing, by the way, but there you go. Wayne Kula says, do you have any tips on understanding the books that Paul wrote? Also, thank you for the video from my last question about Romans. Great help. Oh, wonderful, Wayne. There's a lot of ways that conversation could go. I'm going to give you a couple. One, St. Paul has a particular love and pastoral concern for Gentiles who are becoming Christians. Like, different things are on his radar than are maybe on some of the other apostles' radars to the same extent. So he's deeply aware that someone coming from a Jewish background, preserving as much as they can from that background while they're Christian, might actually be very comforting. You continue to, keep most of the Mosaic law, maybe all of it, but you also believe in Jesus now. That might feel very comforting to someone. But expecting someone else to embrace your culture and the Mosaic law in order to become Christian, he knew from direct experience was this huge pastoral hurdle. So I think a lot of what he's focused on is this. So when you hear all of his stuff about faith versus works, he's talking specifically about the works of the Mosaic law. And that's not the same category of thing as, good works. So this gets complicated over the centuries after Paul, because Augustine makes a point in response to the Pelagians that a lot of Paul's arguments against works of the law are also good arguments against the Pelagian understanding they have to earn their way to heaven, which is true. But it doesn't mean that Paul is writing about good works. Some of his thinking could also apply to good works, depends, kind of a case-by-case basis. But then you get to the reformers, and they're like, aha, we believe in justification by faith alone. And to us, the Catholics look like Pelagians and like Pharisees. And so you'll hear people claiming Catholics are Pharisees. And it's based on centuries worth of misunderstanding who the Pharisees were and what they were about and what they believed in, as well as misunderstanding Catholic teaching as well. So, the Judaizers, I think, was often really meant, but the people who think you have to be circumcised and follow the Mosaic law. Well, very clearly, the Catholic Church does not teach that. Like, if you have an uncircumcised baby and you get him baptized, the church isn't like, well, we got to do this other thing as well. No, that's not the case. So now a generation of Protestant scholars have increasingly realized that their Protestant ancestors had grossly misunderstood Paul on a lot of these points in some pretty massive ways. And so they pioneered what's sometimes called the new perspective on Paul. And those guys don't all agree completely with each other. And I don't think they all agree completely with the Catholic Church, certainly. But they're tapping into something true, which is, I believe it was N.T. Wright who just said we need to look at Paul as answering first century problems in a first century context rather than addressing 20th century problems in a 16th century context, or we would now say 21st century problems in a 16th century context. In other words, we're imagining when Paul's writing, he's writing to us, and he's not. He's writing to the Christians of the places that he says. Now, the things he's saying apply to us in some way often, but sometimes they're just not meant for us. Like sometimes the advice he's giving to one people, that isn't the advice you need to hear, or you need to at least interpret it a little differently. So, like, okay, I'm not going to give you. I think that is clear enough. I'm not going to go down the road of examples because that'll bog me down too much. I want to get to Sir Zorg, who says the best Protestant argument against Catholicism is the rampant bad catechesis among Catholics compared to Protestants, bad fruits. How do I answer this? Yeah, I think a few things. Number one, badly catechized children of Catholic families are much more likely to call themselves Catholic than badly catechized Protestants are likely to call themselves Protestant. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact the culture is Protestant. And so, if you come from a vaguely Protestant background and you continue to be vaguely Protestant, but maybe don't, believe in a lot of this stuff, you probably don't identify particularly strongly with the label Protestant. I mean, to give an example, our president, right? I think his denominational affiliation is something vaguely Protestant, but he'll like put out statements acknowledging the beauty of St. Michael the Archangel prayer or, the birthday of Mary or all of these things in ways that sound extremely Catholic because he doesn't seem particularly tied to the concept of being Protestant. Now, there's a whole layer with like being a political leader and all that. But that's to say, like the people who call themselves Protestant or call themselves whatever kind of Protestant or evangelical or whatever often are much more intentional. Like they're choosing to be that thing. Whereas there's such a culture of being Catholic in the US that I think if you are sort of a fifth generation lukewarm Italian, you might call yourself Catholic, even though you haven't gone to church and, no one in your family's gone to church in 80 years, other than like maybe weddings and baptisms. That's a phenomenon. And I think that the thing worth addressing there is probably this is the bad side of a good thing, which is Catholicism has deep cultural roots. And so even people who are not particularly on fire are often likely to want to claim this label. The second thing is Catholicism is much bigger, and anytime you try to organize an institution, the larger it is, the more chaotic it is, almost by definition. Like compare the crime rate in a small town to a big city, compared to the amount of government and efficiency in a small town to a big city. Exactly like that, So when you have, Protestant, when I was living in DC, a Protestant young woman I knew was going to a church that had 40 people. And the first time she went there, by the time she got back to her house, they'd left a little welcome goodie bag on her front door. I thought that was amazing. But then I also thought that'd be super hard to do in a Catholic church. Like logistically, even if you had a heart for that, it would be so hard to actually accomplish anything like that unless you had like a fleet of cars and all this. So yeah, that's what I would kind of say to that. If you look to the case of Europe, all of the majority Protestant countries are now like steeply either atheistic or Muslim, from what I can tell. And meanwhile, the majority Catholic countries, there are some that are certainly going those routes, but you have much more of a fight being put up, certainly by countries like Poland, say. So, I mean, even Geneva, Geneva famously was the seat of John Calvin. And last I've heard, there are more practicing Catholics than there are practicing Protestants these days in Geneva. So I don't think it's just a case of like, oh, there's this amazing vibrancy in Protestantism worldwide and amazing lukewarmness in Catholicism worldwide. I think you can find pockets of both without a doubt. But I think we might have a bit of a sample error. So if your if your case against Catholicism is that, I would say that. Last thing I say, there's a difference between a poorly catechized Catholic because like the church didn't do a good job of catechizing them, and a poorly catechized Catholic because like they or their family didn't take any steps to receive the right information. One of those is on the church. One of those is not. And so we had an era of pretty bad catechesis for a lot of reasons after Vatican II. I think we've come out of that more or less, although you're going to find pockets of places where it's still very badly set up. But yeah, that's my initial kind of thought. Yeah, let me know if there's anything more to say on that. Saint Rhino says, "Hey Joe, I met you in Draper, Utah. I have a quick question. I have CTE, which can cause aggressive outbursts. Is that considered a mortal sin?" Very easy answer to this. No, it is not. If you do something you have no control over, you are not morally culpable for it. So you, for instance, there have been a whole cases of lethal sleepwalking, where someone commits what would otherwise be the sin and crime of murder while asleep and dreaming about something. In those cases, which can be notoriously hard to establish if there is authentic sleepwalking, but some of them are really clear, where it's like no bad blood at all, and a mother, I don't even want to tell you the details. They're really tragic, but in those cases, no moral culpability at all. In technical terms, sin is located in the will. In every sin that you commit, what we call actual sin, there's an act. That's why it's called actual sin. You have done something you should not have done, or you have failed to do something you should have done and reasonably should have known you should have done. So if those conditions aren't present, even if you've done a bad thing on accident, that's not something you're culpable for. So severe mental illness and all of this can mitigate and even eliminate moral culpability. This is why we can pray for people, even who've committed suicide. The more we understand mental illness, the more we realize they may not be as culpable as we thought they were. That's good news for their soul. Similarly with CTE, obviously, do whatever you can to avoid aggressive outbursts or avoid triggers for the outbursts, or if there's medication you can be taking, then do those things. Because if you don't do, like, if there's reasonable, I don't know enough about CTE to know about like treatment options. If there are things you can be doing and you fail to do it and then you have an outburst, then you're more really culpable, not for the outburst as such, but for the conditions that led to the outburst, because you could have done something different there. But otherwise, there are going to be times where you just aren't in complete control of yourself. That's okay. I mean, not sinful. Bull Moose says, if a mortal sin is not confessed but not purposefully hidden, is it still retained? Like for people who've been away from the sacraments for years, you're supposed to make what's called a diligent examination of conscience, and you can make a diligent examination of conscience and still forget about some things because you don't perfectly remember everything, or maybe you didn't have a good understanding of kind of the nature of the severity of the sin, etc. Or you get some details wrong in your mind where you think you did something twice and you did it 3 times. In those cases, you're not keeping the sin from the confessional. It's covered. I like to always say, for these and any sins which I might have forgotten, I heartily confess at the end of, enumerating my sins. And I would encourage that kind of thing. But the basic premise is that there's a difference between someone who intentionally does not disclose a sin that needs to be disclosed and just not knowing. And, since we're looking at home stuff, this is the same with house sales. If you purposely hide a condition, there's some major problem in the house and you hid it, that is actually not legal. But then there are other times where you sell a house and you didn't even realize there was something else wrong with it. That's not on you. If you did your homework and didn't realize that thing was there. Same is true with the cracks in the foundation of your soul. All right, Vincible Gaming says, are we wrong in assuming infants can't have faith just because they can't communicate that faith? Did John believe in his mother's womb? The question of what we mean by faith is so wrapped up in answering that question. I think it's a very good question, because if faith is trust, infants certainly have some kind of trust that they exercise all the time. So, I mean, our Lord even presents little children as kind of a model for prayer. If you think about it, a baby does not know how to fix what's wrong with them. Usually, they might have an idea like, "Oh, I'm hungry," um, or my diaper is really bothering me because it's full, or whatever else. But it's not even clear how much they're getting that. They just know I am in discomfort and I don't know how to fix it. I'm certainly not capable of fixing it, but I know if I cry out to someone greater than me who loves me, that they will fix it for me if I just cry out enough. And Jesus gives us as the model of what faith in God looks like, because we are exactly the same way. We've got problems in our lives that are bigger than us, ones that maybe we can enumerate, maybe we can't even quite put a pen on it, but we know there's something wrong. And if we've spent any time trying to address it, we know on some level, I can't fix this on my own, but I can cry out. And I know there's someone above me who loves me and is strong enough to fix this for me. And that's what faith is. So if we think about faith in that way, it's quite possible we think about infants having faith. Do they have faith in God or just faith in parents, or is the faith amorphous enough that it's a broad category? That's a good question. If we think about faith in the more like strict sense of belief, without proof of like without the kind of proof that eliminates the need for the act of trust, it's harder to say they have that kind of faith. But so I think I could see a case kind of being made in either direction. We would say in baptism they receive the gift of faith, but that it is not formed yet in a certain way, but they have it in potency. All right. Bread Chan says, "Hi Joe, truly love your deep explanation of Catholic beliefs. Thank you. One question: have you heard of Iglesia Ni Cristo? They're very anti-Catholic. I've heard of them, but I can't say I'm particularly knowledgeable about them. I've even seen some of their local uh, kind of church signs in some area. They're Filipino, right? The name sounds Spanish, but I think that's because Spain colonized Philippines for a long time. Yeah, so they're anti-Trinitarian. Yep, they are a Filipino group that is a little more than 100 years old. They are a restorationist group. This is, again, one of these things. The number of groups claiming, hey, we actually we are the true church. God revealed it to our one founder in the 19th century or the early 20th century. Everyone should follow us. And oh, by the way, we hate the Catholic Church. I think if you just think about the number of groups that are like that, I feel like it's a telling sign, because they can't all be right, but they can all be wrong. And if all these groups that are wrong, at least all but one of them are wrong, are united in their hatred of the Catholic Church, which has a much more plausible claim of being the one true church. I don't know. Part of me just wants to say we got main character energy, but part of me wants to say there's a more serious theological point to be made there. That you see all of these lies being told about Catholicism by all these different groups running in opposite directions, lies that they don't even agree with one another. I just wish people who were in any one of these groups stepped back and said, what would I say to someone who was part of any of these other groups that believed these kind of wild things? Like the Seventh-day Adventists tend to hate Catholicism, and they have, a dubious prophetess, Ellen Goldwhite, and all this stuff. You step back and look at all this stuff and say, okay, well, you guys don't agree with one another. And the stuff you do agree on is probably a red flag that stuff's also wrong. So I don't know. That's kind of where I would go there. Simeon says, what in principle is infallible except the Bible? So infallible means incapable of erring. So there's, from a pedantic standpoint, people will debate whether it's good to call the Bible infallible or not, or just whether it is inerrant, because the Bible isn't still, like, we're not getting new books of the Bible still being written. So the question of infallibility is no longer a question for the Bible. It is inspired, which is more than infallibility, and it is without error. So it's inerrant. I am fine calling it infallible as well, But you will find some people, Peter D. Williams, Carl Keating, etc., who will make a point. I think they're technically right that that's not really what the word infallibility means. It rather refers to a protection from error. And we can talk about that in two ways. God is obviously incapable of speaking erroneously. So, Father, Son, Spirit. The church is protected by God from error in certain contexts, like defining something as a matter of faith. Because if the church could demand that for you to be a Christian, you have to believe this erroneous thing, you would have to choose between heresy and schism. And the Bible condemns both heresy and schism. So it is necessary, it is actually necessary for there to be some kind of infallibility of the church in some contexts. Because otherwise, human sin being what it is, and just human fallibility being what it is, over the course of thousands of years, somebody would have erred, a council or a pope or whatever, and forced everyone to believe a heretical thing, and we'd be in a real pickle. Roberto Tapia, I just saw this question. It's a freebie for you. Says, what has Joe Heschmeyer thought about Miles from Canon and Creed dissing us Catholics? I have not followed that closely. Obviously, I'm somewhat discouraged by it. I mean, I like Miles. He hosted my debate on Seventh-day Adventism. We've talked back and forth in the past. I'm not upset with the idea of, a Protestant explaining why they're Protestant and not Catholic. That makes sense. I should probably take a closer look. I responded to one video where he was on then Pastor Ben's show, and they were just like greatly wrong about the number of cradle Catholics leaving the church, but it wasn't even really their fault. They were credulously reading a news story without digging into the data. It was sloppy more than malicious or anything. So yeah, I am not impressed by that turn. I would actually love to maybe go on his show and talk through some of those issues, because he's someone I do have an esteem for, and yeah, I really admire him. I think he's a good guy. He came out of Adventism, and the thing I'd say there is somebody willing to change their life in that dramatic of a way shows a kind of humility, even if other actions maybe you don't always see it. I think you should trust that a convert almost always has a certain humility, because they're willing to at some point say, I was wrong about everything. So I have a respect for people, even if I think their conversion is incomplete. It's directionally correct. Like, we are closer to him now than we were when he was an Adventist. Does he still carry over some negative stuff about Catholicism from either his Adventist roots or from his time now as a Reformed Christian? Almost certainly. He's probably being fed some bad information. But look, the guy had me on a show one time on Answering Adventism to answer some of what he knew to be false claims against Catholicism. So I think he also tries to be fair. So he's also, the last thing I say here, he's just starting out, in this space. And it's very easy to kind of make a fool of yourself without meaning to. I've done it before. I think everyone has done it. When you think you understand a position and you kind of lay it out and you sort of step on a rake, and you have to sort of, okay, my bad. And then you learn from it and you move on. So I don't know. That's my inclination there. Oh, I want to go back to Simeon's question. I got distracted. My bad. I said generally the church has to be infallible in some cases. In terms of the particular context, that's going to be dogmatic definitions of an ecumenical council, as well as ex cathedra statements of the Pope. But then also, we would talk about the infallibility of what's called the sensus fidelium, the sense of the faithful. Like, if every Christian just knows X is wrong or Y is right, you can trust that because the Holy Spirit is guiding the people of God. I call it people infallibility, but no one finds that clever or helpful. But fine, remember sensus fidelium then. That's on you. And sensus fidei, sense of the faith. So, your fault. All right. Oh, and ordinary universal magisterium. We get into all of this stuff because basically, like, the general principle is this: if you have to believe a thing in order to be Christian, in order to be Catholic, that thing is protected from error, or else God has forced you to make an impossible choice, because he's never going to make you choose between heresy and schism. So that's a nice kind of easy to understand standard. Like, could I deny this and still be considered a Christian by my peers, or not, or by the church or not? Dennis says, what is Satan's ultimate fate? Yeah, lake of fire. He is punished for all eternity for his willful rebellion from God. Daniela says, if Roman Catholics switch rites to Eastern Rite, do you have to accept those extra books like Third and Fourth Maccabees divinely inspired? Who is the right canon? No, the Eastern and Western Christians met numerous times. Well, twice. I shouldn't say numerous times. Met twice at ecumenical councils, Second Leon and Council of Florence, to work on reunion. And at the Council of Florence, they laid out which books were in the Bible, and it's the 73 books in the Catholic Bible. So there are Easterns who, certainly Eastern Orthodox, I don't know about Eastern Catholics, who will use those other books as well, but they are not considered divinely inspired by the church. The argument that you'll sometimes hear people make is, well, Florence doesn't say only these 73 books are divinely inspired, but that's clearly what they mean first. And also, the First Vatican Council speaks of them as having closed the canon. So I don't believe any of the arguments that the canon is still open. So you've got Florence, Trent, and then Vatican I that all address this issue. I didn't even mention the Council of Trent, which infallibly defines the Catholic canon as the 73 books. Matt says, Joe, what is one thing you do not like about being Catholic, i.e. a moral or doctrinal teaching that you agree with in principle but may struggle with privately? Yeah, I think one thing is, the lukewarmness and bad catechesis and the way there can be kind of foolish moves done to try to, I think foolish moves that are well-intentioned. You get a church with 1 billion people. You're going to have times where there's just frustrating things that happen. And those frustrating things, when you multiply that by 1 billion people, that's a problem because it happens a lot. And so that would be, at a very large level, just like you get this, some news story about, a bishop has decided to do this crazy thing. He thought it'd be a good idea to be more ecumenical if we made life worse for Catholics and obscured the differences between Catholicism and Protestantism, or between Catholicism and some weird liberal form of Protestantism, or between Catholicism and non-religion. And you're like, what did you hope was going to happen there? It's never worked. We have such an amazing amount of data that it does not work at all. Look at the free fall of membership in the Church of England. You can't just conform to the world and expect that the world's going to be like, I guess we believe in Jesus now. Rather, the world is just like, okay, I guess you're actually less interesting than we thought. We don't hate you, but we don't care about you either. And then people who are drawn to being religious are just like, why give up my life to follow this watered down version of Christ? So I think you do have enough people who do things like that, who, again, I think they're actually well-intentioned. I think they love Jesus, love their neighbor, and have really dumb ideas about how to bring people to Christ. The homily I heard about it years ago that's always stuck with me is about people in field hospitals in World War II who would water down the morphine to try to make it reach more people. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's a great image, because the effect isn't that now you've saved more people from this pain. It's now you just broke the morphine. Like, now the morphine doesn't work. And so we can kind of break the gospel, as it were, by watering it down where we're not preaching it in its fullness. So that is a general, not very particular thing. In terms of doctrinal teachings, there's an ongoing question about the adoption of embryos produced through IVF. To save them. So, as a general rule, obviously, IVF is immoral. You can't cooperate with this. There is an ongoing debate about, well, what if you're not just like using IVF to try to have a baby? What if you're not creating a baby in the lab? What if the issue is you're a pro-life couple that wants to spare an already created baby from being left to die in a freezer? And it seems to me that's a sufficiently different moral scenario to justify a much more detailed kind of examination of it. But the only time the church has addressed it is the CDF addressed it in, what is that, Donum Vitae? I think it's Donum Vitae in 1987, maybe? I may be wrong about that. I think that's the case. I may be mistaken about that. But let me just see. Sorry, that's going to bother me. Sometimes I say something and then think, I better make sure I'm right about that. Oh, no, Dignitatis Personae, maybe? Yes, sorry. It was Dignitatis Personae, paragraph 19. That was Cardinal Levada in 2008. And since then, I don't know of another time the church has really stepped in on it. And the language around it is, frankly, for me, a little unsatisfactory. I don't dissent from it, but I want to understand better. I want to have, a more fleshed out. I'm not going to go adopt an embryo. I don't have a uterus helps, but I will defer to the church on this. But I'd love to hear more. So the two paragraphs in question three paragraphs in question. Number one, the proposal of these embryos could be at the disposal of infertile couples as a treatment for infertility is not ethically acceptable for the same reasons, which would make artificial heterologous procreation illicit, as well as any form of surrogate motherhood. This practice would also lead to other problems of a medical, psychological, and legal nature. That makes sense. So you've got children who've been created in a lab, and there's an argument, well, could we give them to, couples who are infertile, and win-win situation? And that looks pretty close to using a surrogate. And so the church is saying, don't do it. Can't do that. And it leads to medical, psychological, and legal problems. I mean, the tricky part is, like, we do this with born children, with adoption, right? Like, if a biological family gives their child up for adoption, says we can't take care of this child, or we don't love this child, or whatever. I mean, that's obviously, it's not usually that one, but we don't want this child anymore, or we can't handle this child anymore, whatever. They might put the child up for adoption. And in those cases, an infertile couple might adopt the child. And we generally look at that as good. There are parameters on that. We don't want to create a situation where the poor are kind of exploited into putting their kids up for adoption. But as a general rule, this is something good. So already we're in slightly more complicated moral waters. I'd love to get more into paragraph there. But then the next paragraph says, it has also been proposed solely in order to allow human beings to be born who are otherwise condemned to destruction, that there could be a form of prenatal adoption. This proposal, praiseworthy with regard to the intention of respecting and defending human life, presents, however, various problems not dissimilar to those mentioned above. It's like, okay, there's just no explanation. It's just like, yeah, we also can't do this. Similar reasons as above. It's like, well, spell out kind of what those reasons are, because it's not a very specified sort of approach. So, and then it goes on to talk about this is a situation of injustice which in fact cannot be resolved. And that may be where we're at. Like, we have done something so bad we can't fix it with IVF. That is not something I want to hear. And so it's something I think I struggle with, but that kind of makes sense. All right, John says, can the ministerial priesthood be proved with Leviticus 8 / Aaron's ordination and the washing of the feet at the Last Supper? Too many similarities. Proved, I would say probably not going to prove it to someone. Is that like fitting and almost definitely what's going on? I think you could make a pretty good case. Okay, amazingly, we are 53 minutes in, and I was only getting through questions from last time. So I will tell you now, for anyone who has questions this time, I am not getting through all the questions that are currently on the screen. I don't know how many I will get through. I'm going to do my level best to get through a lot of them, or at least several of them, and then come back in 2 weeks. I think October 20th. Let me double check to make sure. Yeah, October 20th. And we'll tackle all of these. This time I have to do a little bit of a shorter one. I'm not an actual short live stream. I mean, it's almost an hour already, but just because I've got to do another recording today. You'll see from this shirt, it's tomorrow's episode, which I've been traveling. I was on Matt Fradd's show last week. Very exciting, by the way, just casually mentioning that. But it meant that I didn't record my episode for tomorrow. So everything is behind. I'm catching up with everything. Okay. Molotov said, hi, Joe. How are you? How was breakfast? I'm good. I have actually been doing some intermittent fasting. So I've started eating at like 11, but I had a bunch of eggs and sausage at 11. So it still felt very breakfasty and it was delicious. My wife is a good cook. Junior says, any comments on your view of the SSPX? Can we attend? The issue of the SSPX, I've known people in the SSPX who are very kind people, and I think they sometimes come in for an undue amount of criticism, but I think nevertheless, some other people will like underestimate how serious the problem is. Like, the one place you don't want to be spiritually is saying, I know that the church has this authority and I refuse to obey the authority of the church. Because if you listen to Vatican II, like the one group of people that just cannot be saved are people who know they should be Catholic and refuse to be. So don't do that. And with SSPX, the danger is if like a sedeve contest says the Pope is not the Pope. That's one whole set of issues. SSPX will say, no, no, Pope Leo is the Pope, Pope Francis was the Pope, and so on. But we're not going to obey their authority here because we think they're abusing it. We don't think they're using it lawfully. In principle, for the reasons I laid out earlier, it is possible that someone could command you to do something immoral. Like your bishop could tell you to cover up a sex crime, and you say, no, I can't do that. So even though I have a general obedience, Hebrews 13:17 to my authority, to the leaders of the church, I'm not going to be able to do that here. It's much harder to make that case when it comes to papal authority as opposed to just like episcopal authority. I think one would be hard pressed to find clear instances of a pope ever ordering someone to do anything immoral that they were then forced to violate papal authority but we can have that conversation. So they're already on pretty shaky ground. And if they're wrong, then they are just facing off against the church in this way that is obviously sinful and obviously even damnably sinful. And I don't think we talk about that enough because they have beautiful liturgy. They have a real love for all things of the Catholic tradition. And so on so many, many things, we are really marching shoulder to shoulder and we want the same good for the church. But this bit about obedience, it has to be taken so seriously that what God wants more than sacrifice of like the external nature of like animal sacrifice is the sacrifice of obedience. And so when Christ comes into the world, this is what he offers the Father. This is explicit in Scripture. So if you have the most beautiful external mass, but you don't have a heart of obedience, and you're not offering that obedience to both God and his church, which is the body of Christ, that other stuff doesn't matter for nearly as much. He wants something more than he wants the beautiful externals. He wants the internal attitude of obedience. So we can then descend into some of the particulars. In terms of validity of Mass, yes, it is valid. And yes, it actually fulfills your Sunday obligation. As far as I know, there's no reason that like your canon law has a thing. Let me find, sorry. It's canon, I believe it's canon 1246. Let me see if that's right. No. Canon 1248, there it is. A person who assists at a Mass celebrated anywhere in a Catholic rite, either on the feast day itself or the evening of the preceding day, satisfies the obligation of participating in the Mass. That language of Mass celebrated anywhere in a Catholic rite is going to be the thing people debate about, I think, with the SSPX. My inclination is to say they are sufficiently within the church. They aren't formal schismatics, even though the leaders are or were, that it probably meets the Sunday obligation. I wouldn't do it, though, because you don't want to have a question mark next to it. The bigger issues historically were weddings and confessions, which require not just that you have a priest, but that you have a priest with jurisdiction, and they clearly didn't have jurisdiction. So a lot of SSPX weddings are just invalid. It's people who are cohabitating, who think of themselves as married, and their confessions weren't valid. Pope Francis gave a dispensation to allow them to hear confessions validly, and during the Year for Mercy, which he then extended, and I believe that is still the case now. I don't know the case with weddings. I think that can be delegated through the local bishop. He can give permission for the SSPX to celebrate a wedding. But I guess I would just say don't play games where you have to question the legitimacy of sacraments or whether you've met your Sunday obligation, etc. And I would say that in both directions. Like if you're doing some kind of weird liturgical innovation where you've decided like, oh, it's so much more meaningful to me for the Mass to be celebrated with some bizarre like Cats musical, and then we maybe sort of do the words of institution, but there's a question mark. I would say don't go to that. Like that's crazy. Even if you find it personally fulfilling, go where you have validity and go where the church tells you to go, and do what the church tells you to do. Like literally the word rubric comes from the fact that the instructions in the Roman Missal are in red, which is rubricum, I think, in Latin. So just do that. Now, having said all that, I also know that it's much easier to say that about the SPX in a place where I am, where there's plenty of, you can get Latin Mass options without a great deal of difficulty. There's, Institute Parish downtown here. There's Fraternity St. Peter Parish. I don't know, maybe 10 minutes, not even 10 minutes. Yeah, I guess 10 minutes from here. And then you've got like the church I go to, the very Reverend Novus Ordo. So we are not lacking for liturgical beauty. Places that are lacking for liturgical beauty, I understand why there's a draw towards the SSPX. And I think I'd say at the very least, don't go there to fulfill your Sunday Mass obligation or for confession or for weddings. That's what I would suggest. Some of that's just my own advice. All right. UI Josh says, "Hey Joe, how would you argue someone who's saying the papacy wasn't in the early church, but rather a doctrine that developed late, so it's not true?" So 2 books I've written that are relevant to this. The most on point one is the book Pope Peter, which I look at the role that Peter has in the church, and Peter has among the apostles even, and just looking principally at the New Testament itself. And I think we can clearly see from places like Luke 22 that all the disciples are made servant leaders of the church, modeled after Christ himself, who was a servant leader. And then that Peter is made the leader of, or the servant leader of the servant leaders. So he's told to strengthen his brethren, meaning the other 11 or 10, because Judas is going to go a different way. If you understand these things about Peter, there's this Petrine role. This is really everything you need for the basic model of the papacy. Then you combine that with testimonies from the early church. So here I maybe reference my book, The Early Church Was the Catholic Church. That one I don't get into the papacy as such, but I do get into bishops. So one of the objections you'll hear is people claiming that there weren't even bishops in the early church, and that's clearly wrong. There were, and one bishop was given a special kind of, or recognized as having a special kind of authority. And so you have things like Irenaeus in 180 saying that it's a matter of necessity that every church agree with the Church of Rome on account of its preeminent authority. That's what he says. Book 3, chapter 3. That kind of language is sufficiently clear that if that claim is true, then Catholicism is true. I think we could say that, right? Like, if it is a matter of necessity that all churches agree with the Church of Rome, that's premise 1. And premise 2, the Church of Rome clearly teaches Catholicism. And the conclusion is it's a matter of necessity that all churches agree with Catholicism. It's a logically valid syllogism as best I can tell. So there are contours of the papal office that do come later, almost by definition. The mustard seed is going to grow into a mustard tree, so it's not surprising to see more papal authority when you've got better telecommunication. You're going to have more intermediate structures like, College of Cardinals, when the church is too big to have like a direct, you just know the Pope personally kind of situation. Like the bigger it gets, but that's like saying, well, Steve Jobs wasn't really the head of Apple, because when we talk about the Steve Jobs Apple, that was in somebody's garage, and now it's a multi-million or multinational corporation with worth billions of dollars. It's like, yeah, but it's the same thing. It's just gotten bigger. And just as that apple grew into an apple tree, the mustard seed of the church grows into a mustard tree. And Christ describes it as the largest of all garden plants. So if we see Peter having a leadership role in the early church, it doesn't matter if it doesn't look the same as it does for Pope Leo in all contours. It won't. Of course it won't. Pope Leo doesn't govern the same way Pope Francis governs. If that's your bar for disproving the papacy, I don't know why your bar is there, because it doesn't make any sense. So that's what I'd say. B Drake 196, and then in parentheses it says B Drake 196. So I don't know why it says it twice, but I wanted to acknowledge that. It says, is John 20:21-23 a good response to someone saying Jesus' sacrifice is once for all? This is after his death and resurrection. So yeah, there's clearly an ongoing need to forgive sins that you see in places like that. It would certainly suggest we continue to sin and continue to need forgiveness of sins. And you will find people who explain this passage away as saying, oh, that just means that the apostles can preach the gospel. The apostles already could preach the gospel. It makes no sense for Jesus to breathe the Holy Spirit on them and give them a new power if that new power is just literally keep doing what you were doing. I don't think it's good hermeneutics if that's what you're coming to. I did a debate with James White on the propitiatory nature of the sacrifice of the Mass. A lot of that debate gets into some of the details there. So I would just recommend that kind of generally. In the beginning of it, I make the point that if you ask people when they were saved, a Catholic might point to their baptism, a Protestant might point to either their baptism, if they're that type, or like the minute they like turn their life over to Christ, if they're a different type, or whatever. But I've never, in all my years of asking this question to people, had one person tell me they were saved on Good Friday. They always point to some moment in their life. And we agree. What we are agreeing about, without maybe fully processing it, is the merits of Christ on the cross, which were won for us back on Good Friday, have to be applied in our life. And so if you understand the sacrifice of Jesus once for all to mean no further work is to be done at all, well, then none of that makes sense. In fact, you can't say, if that's your belief, that you were saved by faith because you were saved 2,000 years before you ever had faith, right? Like that's, just think about it like that. That if you believe we were at enmity with God and then we're saved by him, by faith through grace in a way that's divorced or not divorced from work, whatever the details there of justification, coming into right relation with God, etc., everybody agrees the merits of Christ have to be applied in our lives. And they're right to agree on that. And so if your understanding of Christ once for all sacrifice is contrary to that, then you've made a grave mistake. Then we can say, how do sacrifices work in the early church, or in the ancient world, I should say, in both Judaism and paganism? How does an ordinary person share in a sacrifice? Like if you are a Jewish kid and you're, let's say you're 13 years old, you don't own a lamb. Your family's so poor, your family doesn't even own a lamb. It's Passover. They sit down with the neighbors for the Passover meal. And the neighbors brought their lamb to the priest, and the priest sacrificed, like killed the lamb. I just started to do it now. We talk about that as a sacrifice. But the reality is, in the ancient world, the sacrifice is much bigger. It's the offertory, it's the killing. In this case, it's also the smearing of the blood. And how do you participate? You participate simply by eating the sacrifice. In 1 Corinthians 10, St. Paul talks about how those who eat the sacrifices become partners in the altar. We enter into a communion with the sacrifice, or with the object of the sacrifice, through the eating of the sacrificial offering. That's how you share in the sacrificial action. That's right there in black letters, whether you're looking at Exodus, the institution of the Passover, or whether you're looking at 1 Corinthians 10, where St. Paul applies this to the Eucharist. That's happening. And therefore, someone who says that's a re-sacrifice just does not understand the ancient world on sacrifice. Pagans and Jews both would participate in the sacrifice. Because remember, like in the example I give, the reason I give the teenager as an example is he didn't own the lamb. He doesn't kill the lamb. He wasn't the one who smeared the blood on the doorpost. So did he not make a sacrifice? No, he did, by eating the sacrifice that was offered. All right. Dennis says, why is Jesus Christ referred to as king rather than emperor? Aren't emperors more powerful than kings? That's a really good question. He's called King of Kings. I think it's just the language of the ancient world in this context. Because like the word emperor existed. Like I said, St. Peter tells us to honor the emperor, but they regularly used the word king. Let me throw out one totally guess suggestion. In the Roman Empire, an emperor was in charge with a bunch of kings beneath him, but the kings were the ones who had a lot of the practical day-to-day authority on the ground in whatever kind of nation. So Herod in Judea, etc. And the king was trying to hold together a bunch of different, the emperor was trying to hold together a bunch of different kingdoms that weren't really united. Christ comes to have one flock with one shepherd, not a bunch of different flocks loosely united in one imperium. So I don't know. That's a total guess, but I wonder if that's not it. Mighty Salmon says, hey, could you ever do another debate with an SDA? The last SDA, Seventh Adventist, seemed like some random guy off the street. Yeah, I was just, Miles asked me to do it. So I did, but I didn't choose a guy. I don't actually know how all of that worked. Perhaps someone with Adventist Defense League. I'd be totally open to it. I mean, honestly, I'm not the world's greatest expert on Adventism. I know Catholicism, so I can just argue here's the Catholic belief that contradicts what I know about Adventism. But I'm not usually like I mean I've read a fair amount. I know more about Adventism than the ordinary person, but less than somebody who really had that as like I'm sure Miles knows more about the ins and outs of Adventism than I do by a lot. But yeah, I'd be open to doing a debate on a topic that was reasonably conversant in and could kind of read up on. But I think my understanding was Miles was having trouble finding Adventists who were willing to debate. Now, that might be because his channel was called Answering Adventism. It wasn't like a neutral forum, but I'd be open to it. All right. Gabe says, hey, Joe, Wisdom 3, 7 to 8 says that God's people will shine and judge. Similar to Jesus' words in the Gospels. Jesus alluding to this? I think he certainly could be. They will govern nations and rule over peoples, and the Lord will reign over them forever. That also is just like a true statement of the Christian destiny. So you've got several different times things like that seem to be pointed to. It's hard. One of the things, I think we have to be careful with on the Catholic side is we want to say, look, this part of the Old Testament, the Deuterocanon, matches perfectly with this thing in the New Testament. And doesn't that seem to prove that the Deuterocanon is part of the Bible? And I think the answer to that is yes, but some of those quotations have similar quotations in books that are accepted by Protestants. So the fact that, you might find like the potter and clay, to take one example, being referenced. One of the things going on there, so potter and clay is referenced in Jeremiah and Wisdom 15 and I think Sirach. Yeah, right. As clay is in the hand of the potter, for all his ways are as he pleases, so men are in the hand of him who made them to give them as he decides. That sounds a lot like the argument St. Paul makes about the potter and the clay in Romans. But there's enough images of potter and clay used in Isaiah, Jeremiah, etc., that people could say, well, maybe he doesn't mean those. Maybe he's not referring to wisdom or Sirach. Maybe he's referring to Jeremiah or Isaiah. Or I think we would say maybe it's all of the above. So just be careful. Don't imagine it's going to be like a silver bullet argument if you can find similar-ish passages elsewhere. But I think it at least points to a cumulative case. This looks and sounds an awful lot like the Bible. For my money, I think your stronger case was actually the chapter before. Wisdom 2, in the description of the death of the Son of God, is so remarkably Christological when you compare it especially to the gospel account in Matthew's gospel, that I don't see a way getting around that. It isn't like it gets one or two details right by coincidence. It's that it just seems like prophetic, and it's clearly written before the time of Christ. 12 Pillars says, did Pastor Eternius make papal pronouncements prior to Vatican I retroactively infallible? I really struggle to reconcile the letter and spirit of Unum Sanctum with Unitatis Redingratio. It is necessary for all men to be subject to the Roman Pontiff to be saved. However, we also know from long before Vatican II that those teachings should be understood of a willful, sinful disobedience. Trent just did a response to Redeem Zoomer called Answering Redeem Zoomer's 14 Catholic Contradictions. It is excellent. I like it partly because it saved me a lot of work because I was working on a similar thing and realized he'd already done it and done it very well. I'm going to do a variation for tomorrow, but I would refer you to his as a general kind of primer for sure. And that lets me do a couple deep dives without trying to hit everything. But even in Redeem Zimmer's video, if you saw that, he quotes Torquemada, right? I believe it was the Inquisitor, Torquemada's uncle, who talks about like people who, at the time you had what was called the Papal Schism, where you had three different people claiming to be Pope, and people were confused about who the real Pope was. The people who got it wrong on accident were not guilty of deliberate schism. They just weren't. And the church recognized that they weren't. And there are blesseds and saints who I think were on both sides of that question because it was a very confusing, tumultuous time in the church. Similarly, and so you'll notice, like by the mere language of the Bull of Unum Sanctum, you would think that the church would say, aha, therefore everyone who didn't guess which pope was the real pope went to hell. But that's not how we've ever understood what Unum Sanctum was saying. Let me give another example. Jesus talks about the necessity of faith. We talked about babies a little bit ago, but an unborn child who's not even like conscious yet, or let's say a child who's been born, a baptized baby, they've received the gift of faith in baptism, but they haven't made any like personal decision to follow Jesus, any of these things. They haven't done any of the works Jesus has called them to do. By neither a Catholic nor a Protestant accounting of their salvation is that baby going to hell, because they didn't disobey. They were incapable of doing everything Christ had called them to do. So when we read Bull of Unum Sanctum, when we read Vatican II, when we read anything Jesus says or the church says, take it with the background understanding that if you're told you must do X, this presupposes you can do X. God is never going to command you to do the impossible, and you're not going to be in trouble for, like, you literally weren't even aware, like you left for the day and you got an email after business hours and then you didn't fulfill it by Monday, but it was because you had innocently left for the day. You that was not disobedient. That wasn't even neglectful, as long as you were, leaving when you were supposed to and all that. Similarly, with Christianity, don't turn this into some exacting kind of legalism in a way that's contrary to reason. Those things are put on people who know that they're meant to do X and are capable of doing X. And that's true back then, and that's true now. And you will find moralists talking about it back then as now. There is a shift, but the shift is largely just how many people we imagine are ignorant. And that shift isn't something you're bound to believe one idea or the other. You can think, yes, it is technically possible for a Protestant to be saved, but not many will. You can think it is possible for a Protestant to be saved, and many will. That we don't have an answer to that, because that is beyond our competency. We don't know the mind of God on that issue. But the general principle that willful rejection of the Pope is damnable is true. And as I said before, Vatican II is very clear that those who know the Catholic Church is necessary for salvation and refuse to enter cannot be saved. So we want to just make that, like, all that's happened between Unum Sanctum and Unitatis Redingratio, I think, can be summed up with an emphasis on this basic part of moral theology that was already known, which is that for a sin to be a mortal sin, it has to be done with knowledge and consent, in addition to the act being grave of its nature. There's more kind of going into the weeds on all of that, but that's what I would say to that. Like, I believe Unum Sanctum is true. I even think it's probably infallible, but I don't think that there's any real problem with scoring with Unitatis Redingratio if you read both in their proper context, and if you read some of the middle documents, like the ones in the 1400s, or the ones acknowledging the validity of Orthodox sacraments back in like 1215, that sort of thing. Spiritual Weapon says, any tips on persuading my local church into a TLM? It's tricky these days. I think you can express your desire for it. I don't think there's any like tool you can use to like coerce them into it. I think you can encourage, short of that, some liturgical changes that would probably make it more similar to TLM. You can ask for more parts in Latin. You can ask for the Mass be said ad orientem. You can simply express your own view on it. I mean, understand at the outset, if you're one person in a parish wanting the Mass be one way, that doesn't carry a lot of weight no matter what it is you want. But if you are supportive and sane and reasonable and all of that, and express your personal preference and desires and all of those things, that's, I think, the best you can do, and many priests will be open to at least hearing you out on that. But as I say, it is trickier now. We're in something of a question mark period in terms of Traditionis Custodes and its implementation, because we're waiting to see kind of what Pope Leo is wanting to have be a lasting remedy with the Mass, and he's sort of said he's thinking about what to do and doesn't know. So we'll see. Josue Creston, I think I mentioned this last time. My wife is a Creston, but she's YN, not AN. I mean, that's her maiden name. And I also still don't know. I meant to ask her how to pronounce your first name, and I apologize. Should we hold the traditional authorship, Hebrews, Pentateuch, etc.? Also, your thoughts on Pope Leo's comment on death penalty and being pro-life. On traditional authorship, I don't put a ton of weight on it in general. So I'm extremely skeptical. Okay, let me start with what I am pretty sure is not true. A lot of the 20th century scholarly theories about like basically committees, you have this document and then it's edited and compiled and re-edited and everything else. Um, I'm dubious of almost all of the particular conclusions that those people came to in terms of those scholars. One of the kind of most glaring things is I'm not sure any of them have ever really written anything that I like. Find me a document that is written the way they claim the Old Testament was written. I mean, any of the books of the Old Testament. It's such a weird kind of format, and we don't see these wildly different variations of most of the books and all this. There's a handful of books where you've got some substantial variations, like Isaiah, etc. But and Isaiah and Daniel in particular, Daniel's an interesting one where it does seem to be clearly different things put together. You have different, like you've got Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic texts. So there's not even an attempt to be like, oh yeah, this is all from the same source. It's a gathering of documents. So on those things, I think it's fair to say some of that stuff does get gathered, almost certainly. On the Pentateuch, the last chapter of the death of Moses, no one's ever thought Moses wrote that. So you can have multiple authorship for a lot of those books. I think a lot of the modern theories about what that looked like are probably wrong and just guessing in the dark. I don't think there's a lot of weight to any of. I mean, even very smart people are guessing, having just no idea. Like, there's nobody ever claimed before the modern era it was actually so and so who put it all together. So we're guessing completely blind here, and so I put a near zero amount of credibility on any of that. Traditional authorship is tricky. I'm not well enough versed on it, and I don't hear me wrong on this. I don't care as much about it as some people do, for the simple reason that the inspiration of the book isn't tied to the human authorship. Like, I think the Holy Spirit guided the process, whether that was just a single human author like Moses, or whether Moses spoke something and it was written down and then other people wrote other things down as well. I think that could certainly be the case, and it could still authentically be called like books of Moses. And you could even say things as Jesus does, like Moses said X, in the same way that, like, we'll quote the New Testament and say, as I just did, Jesus says X without meaning that Jesus wrote the New Testament. He didn't. Sorry, Quran. Hebrews, that one has a lot of early controversy about the authorship, so I don't put a strong weight behind it being Pauline. The Council of Trent refers to it as Pauline, but it doesn't declare that. It just references it as like Paul's letter to the Hebrews. That doesn't give any real magisterial weight to it at all, because they're not teaching that. I don't know if that makes sense. Okay, as for thoughts about Pope Leo's comment on death penalty and being pro-life, I do a lot of things like this where I'm asked questions off the cuff, and occasionally in being asked a question off the cuff, you kind of search for an answer and do the best you can. I think it's very clear if you watch that video, that's exactly what's happening with Pope Leo. I think anyone who's ever been in that situation knows, like, he was caught off guard, initially says he doesn't know much about the situation, could have just stopped there, but decides to give a general kind of principle that these issues are kind of complicated because there's a lot of pro-life issues at hand, and in that context mentions the death penalty. And are you really pro-life if you are advocating for the death penalty? I get what he's doing. I would say, in terms of, like, look, okay, maybe first thing, there's no magisterial weight behind an off-the-cuff papal remark, and so there's no need to twist ourselves in and not trying to figure out what did he mean by that. Like, he might have meant next to nothing about that. Sometimes you just say something off the cuff and the thought didn't come out quite right or fully formed or whatever. When I first heard it, I didn't even like strike me as particularly interesting that he'd said it. When I saw people like analyzing it and like parsing it out as just like a written sentence, then I was like, oh yeah, I get why. Like, I understand why people are like, hey, that was not a good answer. But it seemed like a very normal answer, kind of in the midst of the thing, in the heat of the moment. We'll see whether he tries to present anything like that in a teaching context. I think it is relevant to say Evangelium Vitae by John Paul II does talk about how a culture of life is going to have something to say about death penalty. So we don't, like, John Paul II doesn't say death penalty is always and everywhere wrong, but he talks about this as a context in which we should place the problem of the death penalty. And so I would recommend that as helpful reading on this topic. And one of the great advantages is he has the advantage of just sitting down and putting together, with, I'm sure, a lot of help, magisterially, forceful kind of teaching instruction that is very deliberately done, as opposed to an off-the-cuff question. Clinton says, I see there is some speculation of reunification with the Greek Orthodox Church. Do you see this as a possibility with the November 25th meeting? I would be shocked and delighted if it happened within my lifetime. There's so many things going on. But then again, I'm sure it's what people said about like the fall of the Soviet Union. So that's one of the things to keep in mind. Like, we should be hopeful, we should be prayerful. With the Orthodox in particular, we are so close and yet so far apart. On major doctrinal issues, we are so close. I think there is a loss of... I think Catholics are often oblivious to the existence of the Orthodox, and some Orthodox are suspicious of Catholics and the intentions of the Pope and of the Catholic Church. I don't want to universalize in either direction, but I think those attitudes are maybe as much a thing that needs to be healed as anything else. So hopefully it's at least a healing bit. We can do a lot to make this situation better. And I think the existence of things like the internet can draw people out of their bubbles and enclaves and everything else. All right, Wayne says, so I'm having a lively debate with my Lutheran sister-in-law. My main argument is asking her, where does any Protestant authority come from? Yes, if you haven't read it yet, I would recommend St. Francis de Sales' book, Catholic Controversy, which talks about that. He gives that argument in very good form. Wayne then goes on to say, she seems to keep deflecting by stating all the things Catholics do are wrong. Any ideas? I would say Protestantism can't just be, I don't like Catholicism. Like, you can't just be the rebel offshoot of the Catholic Church. For a lot of different reasons. One, that's no reason to be Lutheran as opposed to anything else. Two, that's so clearly not of God. Meaning, like, Christ builds a church. He doesn't just say, we are not the Pharisees, or we are not the Romans, or we are not the Samaritans, or whatever. Like, he does a positive thing. And so if all you have is a derivative and negative thing, I mean negative here in the sense that you're negating the Catholic Church, you're protesting it, that's not the kind of thing that looks like it is of God. That's never how he has acted in the creation of Israel and the creation of the church, etc. He's put forward a positive vision and gathered his people together. And so if your principle of Protestantism is just we reject the Catholic Church and then we don't have any positive idea of whether you should be Lutheran or Presbyterian or Quaker, Amish, Mennonite, let's go into all of those Anabaptist ones, that's not a satisfying answer at a merely logical level, and it doesn't look like the way God acts. So I would kind of call it out as deflection. I mean, if you're having a lively debate, you can say, look, I understand you don't like the things the Catholic Church is doing. My question is much simpler. How can men preach unless they are sent? Nobody sent your priests or pastors to preach. That's not how biblical leadership looks like. In the same way that if somebody was like, let's say they're living in sin, they've left their spouse and they've taken up with some other woman, and you call them out on it and say, hey, you can't do that to my Lutheran sister-in-law or whatever. And they said, oh, she does so many things that drive me nuts. Like, that might all be true. And you still can't do this thing you're doing because it is completely unlawful and it's immoral. So I'd say the same thing. Like, you just like you can't break up a marriage, you can't break up the union of the church. These things are wrong, even if other parties in the marriage or other parties in the church do things that are also wrong sometimes. It doesn't justify your wrong behavior. Matt says, thoughts on a papal succession video. I should do a papal succession video. I'm going to get through just this in the next question, and I'm going to start with Tom's question on homosexuality and like a gazillion questions after that next time. Sound good? Because it's 2:30 now, and I do need to record this thing. Okay, Matt wants to know if I'll do a papal succession video because a lot of Protestants, he says, a lot of Protestants I know are abandoning Peter as rocks and say, acknowledge it's pretty clear. but now say nothing says it will continue. Philip at Ephesus. Yeah, I think it's worth doing a video. I don't know. I don't have an immediate idea to do one, but I think, yes. The first thing is maybe just acknowledging how weak that argument is. Jesus says marriage is between a man and a woman. Does he explicitly say that's going to be true in future generations? No. But that seems to be the obvious conclusion one would take. So while we want to acknowledge that, yes, some of the things that the apostles are called to are unique to the first century, and they have some unique authority that doesn't pass on, like being able to speak in an inspired way, that they can write scripture, they can do all this stuff. Nevertheless, the baseline assumption should be that it does continue, not that it doesn't. Right? Like in most cases, when Christ teaches something, we don't assume an expiration date unless he tells us otherwise. We assume there's not an expiration date unless it's clear from context that there would be. That's the first thing. Second, logically, you don't need Peter less than the first century. Meaning, even if you didn't have Peter in a papal kind of role, you would have 11 other apostles plus St. Paul. You'd have 12 apostles even without Peter. So one could argue that if, I think the way to present this would be to ask, why did Jesus put Peter in this position of authority? Because a lot of Protestant sources will act like Peter's just naturally a leader. But it's like, no, he's explicitly given authority by our Lord. He's told to lead. He doesn't just rise to the top. He is put in that position. Why does Jesus do that? And if you understand why Jesus does that, that's going to answer the question of why that continues on to this day. Because, again, the leaders, not less, in the first century, you get a bunch of people who've conversed with our Lord. They know Jesus' teachings from the lips of Jesus. You've got 12 other people who are apostles who've been given this kind of divine authority. You don't seem like you need Peter at all. And even there, you've got Peter that suggests Peter's going to continue. Next, John 21. I lay this case out in a much more thorough fashion in Pope Peter, but John 21 is viewed by people like Augustine as a kind of allegory of the church, where it's not about the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, which is 1 through 20. John 20 ends with a sort of conclusion. John 21 is an epilogue. So even though it looks like it's just about Jesus once more appearing to the disciples, the point of the chapter is to show what happens between now and eternity, which is why there's 7, the eschatological number of eternity, and why Jesus is on the shore and the boat is going towards him. And all this imagery looks like we're headed towards eternity with Christ. And in that context, Peter says, I'm going fishing, and the others say, we will go with you, which is already rich and loaded. Go back to Luke 5, the first miraculous catch of fish. Jesus tells Peter he's going to become a fisher of men. Then you have this other lesser known miracle for some reason, Matthew 17, where there's a miraculous catch of 1 fish with a coin to pay for just the temple tax of Jesus and Peter. Then you have this third miraculous catch of fish where by themselves, Peter and the apostles can catch nothing. Then at the command of Jesus, they're going to be able to catch a lot. Add to this Matthew 13, 47 to 50, where the church is compared to a net containing good and bad fish. So that looks like, while on the surface, maybe unintentional fishing pun. On the surface, it's about fishing. Beneath the waters, it's pretty clearly about the church and evangelization, because every other time we've seen this in these kind of Petrine contexts, that's been what's like all these other fishing miracles, and yet Matthew 13, all that. That looks like that's what we're talking about. Then, like I said, at the command of Jesus, they can't catch any fish. And before the command of Jesus, they can't catch any fish. At the command of Jesus, they catch so many they can't bring the fish in. They can't haul them in. Peter swims ashore. The other 6 follow. They can't bring the net in. At Jesus' command, Peter goes and single-handedly brings the net to shore. And we're told by John that the net does not tear, which is fascinating. First, because Peter's able to do this supernaturally, apparently. I've seen some Protestant commentators who seem to think that Peter was just like super yoked, but I don't think that's what was going on. Rather, like Peter can do what they all couldn't do by themselves. Just as none of them were able to catch the fish on their own, at Jesus' command they can. Now Peter can bring the net ashore. And when Peter's pulling the net in, it does not tear. The Greek word there is schizo, where the word schism, schizophrenic, a bunch of other words come from, which just means, torn. So there's no schism in the church if we stay with Peter. That's what I would say. And John 21 is clearly not just about the first century church, but the whole journey of the church until the eschaton. So we should expect a Petrine leadership of the church for that time period. There's one final thing to say. This is, again, just a logical one. I think John 21 is actually the strongest argument. And then you do have some evidence in Acts of, things like calling Matthias as an apostle after the death of Judas. We can get into all that. But the structure of the church is not, like, if Jesus wanted a congregational church, or if Jesus wanted a Presbyterian church, if he wanted a church to look like a non-denominational church, whatever, he could have done all those things. He could have created the People's Democratic Republic of God, whereas, the people choose their leaders, etc. He doesn't do any of that. He creates the kingdom of God and his top-down leadership. No one chooses him, pretty famously. No one chooses the apostles except him. The apostles, rely on divine authority to choose the successor. The apostles didn't go around. The one time you get anything like democratic leadership is in Acts chapter 6, the calling of the 7 deacons. They encourage people to present good candidates, but even then, it's the apostles who lay hands on the candidates. So it's consultative, but it's still top-down in terms of the authority. So you have all this stuff showing this top-down leadership. If Christ wanted to build any of the various Protestant models of governance, he obviously could have done that. So why didn't he do that? Why did he do something that looks way more papal? I would suggest we already have an answer to that. Okay. God bless you guys. I really enjoyed doing this with you today. Remember, 2 weeks from now, there'll be more. I know I honestly hate to leave you all hanging because it's been 96 minutes and there's still 300 people in the chat, which is glorious. But 2 weeks from now. And if you want more, might as well do a pitch. $5 a month, you can get the other, like the off Monday. $10 a month, you also get Fridays, as long as I'm not on that Frad show during that time, or, whatever. So you can get 4 times as many live streams as this for like $10 a month, or 2 times as many live streams as this for $5 a month. It's a blast. I enjoy it. I hope you enjoy it as well. God bless you all. And see you soon.